Excellent. We're going to continue with Hilchos Berachos. By the way, I would like to move on from Halachos of Berachot to another topic, so I'm open for suggestions, but I had a couple more things I wanted to finish off on the previous series. And what I'd like to speak about today is very, very relevant in practical halacha. In previous weeks, we spoke a little bit more about some of the theoretical halachas around some of the machshava around what brachos are and how they work and the thoughts behind the language of brachos and the like. This week, I'd like to look at very practical halacha ma'isa. And the first topic I want to look at is bread meals. So the basic principle is that anything eaten in a bread meal is considered to be tofel, insignificant in comparison to the bread itself, and therefore covered by the beracha of hamotzi. Do we have topics left over from brachos from last time? By the way, did I ask someone to remind me last time about topics I said I would cover? Does anyone remember that? No, I had a feeling I had asked someone to make notes of things we still need to cover. So if anyone has those notes, you can tell me. Otherwise, I will carry plodding on. Okay, so the core halacha is that when you are eating a meal, anything in the meal is considered tofel. It's considered subservient to the bread and therefore covered by the beracha of hamotzi. So let me remind you that in previous shiurim, we spoke about, I don't know if you have a piece of bread, a piece of cracker, and on top of the piece of cracker you spread, I don't know, a tuna or something like that, or egg. You don't say hamotzi, mazonos, and shahakol, because you consider the spread to be subservient to the cracker. You're eating a cracker and you're putting the spread on to put the spread on the cracker. So it's covered by the beracha of mazonos on the cracker. Or similarly, if you have a salad of rice and peas and it's a mixture, or a cholent of carrots and meat and potatoes, you only make the beracha on the majority ingredient because that covers everything. It's considered to be a potato dish with bits of meat in if the majority is ha'adama. It's considered to be a rice salad with bits of peas in if the majority is rice, and if you would just say mazonos. So this is the general halacha of ikar, the main food, and tofel, the food which is considered subservient to it, like the egg spread on the cracker. That's with all foods. When it comes to bread, a bread meal, we assume that all foods are subservient to the bread. So the bread is the foundation of the meal, and everything else is an attachment to it. Now, this feels a little counterintuitive perhaps nowadays, where we don't like eating that much bread, and thankfully we live in a world where there's lots of luxuries and lots of other foods, and perhaps for health reasons, so we don't like eating a lot of bread. Nonetheless, the halacha remains in place that the beracha on the bread covers the fish and the potatoes or the chips and the meat that you're having. This is all considered part of the meal. Though in a minute, we'll look at possible exceptions to this rule, but that's the background to this. Now, this is with respect to food, because all the food is really coming for the subservient purpose to the bread, which is to fill you, to sustain you. So bread is the core sustaining food, and therefore the chicken and the other food that I'm having is all covered with that. What about liquids, drinks? Why should drinks be covered by the beracha on hamotzi? Drinks are coming for a different purpose. They're coming to give you liquids to deal with thirst, rather than to sustain you with food. So again, food, chicken, is considered part of the bread meal because it's coming to sustain you, which is the role of the bread. What about a liquid though? A liquid's not coming to sustain you. A liquid is coming to deal with your thirst. So the truth is there can be liquids which are coming to sustain you. If you have a thick soup, even though it's a liquid, you're having it as a food to sustain you. But what about a liquid which is clearly coming as a drink, water or orange juice or the like? So the answer is that is also covered by the beracha of bread, because when one eats, one also drinks. And if it's part of the eating experience, the drinking is facilitating the eating experience. When we eat, we also drink because we want the liquid to lubricate our mouths, to wash the food down. And eating makes us have a dryness in our mouths, and therefore we want to put liquid in again. So the drinking is presumed to be subservient to the eating also, and therefore it's also covered by the beracha. Now, there can be exceptions to the rule. There could be examples where it is clear that liquids, or possibly clear, that the liquid is not subservient to the food. And we'll discuss a couple of examples. One example is where you were very thirsty before the meal began. So it's clear you're not just having the drink because of the meal, but you're also having it because you're thirsty. Nonetheless, the assumption of the poskim is that that's also covered by the hamotzi, because it's true that you're having it because you're thirsty, but you're also having it because you're eating, and therefore it's considered part of the meal. Sometimes you can have a liquid which isn't part of the meal because it is clear that there is another purpose to the liquid. For example, if you wish to have alcohol, right, it's an alcoholic drink. You're not really having because you're thirsty. It's not why you drink alcohol. If you drink alcohol because you're thirsty, then we should speak afterwards about whether that's sensible or not. You're not having the alcohol to wash the food down. It's not a way to wash the food down. You're having alcohol because you want some alcohol in your meal. You want some chaim, or you want to get a little bit inebriated or the like. Nonetheless, even in that case, the assumption of the poskim is that it's still a liquid and still effectively part of the meal. In particular, because people use l'chaim to arouse appetite. So, and as an appetizer of sorts, a little drop of alcohol at the beginning of the meal is used as a sort of appetizer, as it were, gets sort of stomach juices going and so on. And therefore, in general, even these are covered by the beracha of hamotzi. Now, I'm saying in general because there could be situations where this isn't the case. If you are having serious quantities of alcohol just for the sake of alcohol rather than just a small amount as an accompaniment to the meal, then it may be that you do need to make a beracha on it. Nonetheless, as I said, in general, the assumption is that any food and even any liquid that you have is all covered by the hamotzi. Okay, so I'll pause there for a minute just in case any questions, but just to summarize what we've said so far. We'll look at other exceptions in a few moments, but for now, anything which is the sustaining part of the meal, chicken and rice and potatoes and fish and quiches and all these sorts of things are all covered by hamotzi, because the hamotzi is the framework which includes then all other nourishing and sustaining parts of the meal. Liquids you may think are to deal with thirst and therefore the beracha shouldn't be covered. Nonetheless, our working assumption is that liquids also are there as part of the meal, because you have the liquids as part of the meal in order to help you eat and wash food down and so on. There could be rare cases where a liquid is clearly not part of the meal, but in general, we would assume that liquids are part of the meal and also covered by the beracha of hamotzi.
Yes, just because it's not considered part of the meal. So
okay, so first of all, when do we say Kiddush? When do we do Kiddush? We do it before the meal. So we'll come on later to foods that you eat before the meal. So your point is a fine point, but we will address it when we look at foods that are eaten before the start of the meal. Whereas here we're talking about once something is in the meal. Yeah. Okay, what are the exceptions to this rule? So one exception to this rule is food which enters the meal completely unexpectedly. So it wasn't in any way part of the planned meal at the time that you washed. Now, any food in the house is considered by default to be available for the meal and therefore included in the beracha. So let's say you wash on bread and you sit down and you're planning to have a potato and a piece of fish. And then you feel peckish afterwards and you go prowling around your fridge and you discover in the fridge that there's some leftover rice from yesterday and a bit of meat left over from Shabbos, and you decide to have that also. That is assumed part of the meal. In other words, the presumption when you sit down to eat is that you have any food which is available in your house that's all potentially part of the meal, and because people change their minds mid-meal and decide to include things, so that's all covered. However, what happens if an outsider brings more food into the meal unexpectedly? So you're in the middle of your meal, and then there is a knock on the door, and your neighbor says, "Oh, I was just, making a challenge, a stew, and I thought of you, and I brought some round." So, number one, you have a very nice neighbor. Excellent. Would that be included in the meal? So the psak for Sephardim is that is not included in the meal, and therefore you would have to make a bracha on it. So it'd be an interesting and rare exception to the general rule, which is the Sephardi psak. They say since this is wholly unexpected, it isn't included in hamotzi. The Ashkenazim paskin like the view of the Ramah, and the view of the Ramah is even in that case, since neighbors sometimes bring gifts around to each other, and deliveries sometimes arrive, that would be included in the bracha, and therefore you don't make hamotzi on it. So even in a relatively surprising scenario, nonetheless, when you sit down and eat, you sort of have in mind whatever, any food I've got in the house, and even food that neighbors will bring me. For Ashkenazim, the only exception of food that would be considered really excluded from the meal is if you literally have to go out and buy it and go shopping to get it. So you're in a bad way, right? You have your meal and you're so ravenous that you decide that you have to schlep around to Kosher Kingdom or Tapuach to get some more food. That wouldn't be included in the meal because that's really bringing something new in that really wasn't even owned by you beforehand. So that would be the only exception. That would be food that's brought in outside. So that's exception number one to the rule that bread covers all food, which is, we said, it even covers liquids because we assume they're part of the eating, but food which is wholly unexpected and enters into the meal and in no way was part of the meal beforehand isn't included. For Sephardim, that means food that's even brought out as a gift. Ashkenazim, it generally is taken to mean only food that's brought as a purchase. Sorry, yes. Yeah.
Is it considered like all the food in the restaurant is considered part of the meal? You don't know what
yes, it's a really good question. So a restaurant, it would not be considered a new purchase because that's very normal in a restaurant that you decide after you've had one portion, maybe you want to buy something else. It's maybe not normal or typical, but it's not vanishingly rare either. It's normal enough that would be considered the same. So that wouldn't be considered like a new purchase. Yeah.
What about if you finish a meal but you've benched? Once you've benched and you need foods, it doesn't count.
Okay, excellent. So if you've benched, it definitely doesn't count. That's a new meal. So once you're benched, you would have to make a new bracha. What happens if you decide to finish the meal? You've decided you've finished eating. Maybe you've even said to everyone, let's bench. Or maybe you've cleared the table off and then you're schmoozing and 20 minutes later, the schmooze has gone longer than one thought. And you say, oh, let's bring in some more food. Or it's a wedding and the waiters have already gone up. They often clear the tables for the last dance before they even give out after, maybe because they want to make space or they just want to begin tidying up and washing up and so on. So the tables are cleared. So I don't want to go into all the technical details. The Gemara discusses something called siluk shulchan. In the olden days, people would eat, like these Roman pictures. You have Roman dinners, people would sort of lie on couches and there'd be little tables next to everyone. And then the servants would come and clear away the tables. And that was the end of the meal. So when I said siluk shulchan, the removal of the table, even though you haven't yet benched, indicates clearly that the meal is ended. And therefore any food you have after that would need to be, you would need to make a new bracha on. However, the general consensus, again, is nowadays our eating habits have changed and that halacha doesn't apply. Until you've benched, you haven't benched, right? So till you bench, there's always an assumption that you may get peckish and get a little bit more food. And therefore, even the Gemara says that if you say havlon and avarich, let's bench, again, that would be a clear indication at the end of the meal. In practical halacha, we don't paskin like that. And until you've started benching, you haven't started benching the meals, not over. So even though they clear up the tables in the chasna, nonetheless, you know that there's more food around, right? You know that there's a buffet outside, and you know that the waiter will bring you something if you ask for it, or there may be still planning to bring the afters. We'll talk about afters later, but they may still be planning to bring food. So the assumption is the meal's not over till it's over. So benching, the meal is over. So anything after benching, you have to make a bracha. In practical halacha, till you've benched, the meal's not over. It's still part of the meal, even though there's theoretical discussion around societies which have different eating habits to our own. Okay, so to summarize what we've said so far, anything in the meal is included in the bracha, including drinks, but maybe not super surprising food, which was wholly unexpected. In a restaurant, it's not unexpected to buy more food, but at home to go out and buy shopping, that's clearly a change of mind. No one would do that. Like, normally you'll buy all the food in advance for a meal. So food in the fridge, that's not wholly unexpected. Food bought as a present, even that maybe is not wholly unexpected, but going out and buying food, there definitely is, and therefore you'd have to make a new bracha. So that's exception number one. Exception number two, which gets a little bit to your Kiddush scenario, but we'll come to that in a few moments, is wine. So wine is considered the most prestigious of drinks, and therefore the halacha is that if you're having wine, you're having it for its own reasons. You're not having it just as a lubricant. You're not just having it as a, to wash food down. But you're having it. You're not even thirst generated by eating. You're having it because you want to enjoy the wine experience, and therefore, if you have wine in the meal, you would have to make bo priagofen on the wine that wouldn't be covered by the hamotzi. Having said that, if you made kiddush before the meal, then you wouldn't have to make a bracha on wine in the meal. Why not? Because you made the bracha on the kiddush beforehand. So if it's, let's say, a weekday meal, or you had kiddush in shul, and when you sit down to eat, you haven't had kiddush, and then you have wine in the meal, you would have to say beracha gofen. But if you have kiddush and straight away move into the meal, then the beracha gofen and the kiddush would cover the wine that you have in the meal, and therefore this halacha wouldn't have practical implications. So yes, no. Yeah.
I've been at like a meal on Shabbat before where they bring out a new bottle of wine like, in the middle of the meal. That's like being hidden away, so that it wasn't like there when this was being said, and then they said like another bracha on it. Do you remember what it was? Something about like not being great or something.
Okay, so there is a Gemara that says that if you make a bracha on wine, let's say it wasn't even hidden away, it was there, and you had 2 wine bottles on the table. One wine is a cheap, rubbishy wine, £4.50 from Tesco, assuming it's kosher, and the other wine is a £90 bottle of Chateau Neuf from somewhere posh in France. And you have the cheap wine first, you say beracha gofen on it. So there's a Gemara that says that on the better wine, you would say another bracha, hatoiv v'hametiv. Thank Hashem for his goodness in bestowing upon us the bounties of goodness. And therefore you'd make a separate bracha because the second wine is clearly a qualitatively better experience than the first wine, and therefore it gets a new bracha. So that's not to do with halachas of meals that we're talking about, that's just a halacha in wine. Having said that, in general, most people don't keep this halacha nowadays. And the reason is because the quality, exactly how to define qualities of wine is not so clear cut. There are very cheap wines that are actually very good qualities and very expensive wines that aren't. And a lot of it is built around the label and the promotion of the brand and the like. And it's very hard to define exactly what's called a better wine and a worse wine. And sometimes your wines that even experts disagree upon, and one person thinks it's great and another one doesn't particularly like it. So we've sort of lost a clear convention or expertise to exactly define what's a good wine and not a good wine. And if in general this bracha isn't said, I guess as a general, there are those that do say this bracha, but it's quite rare for it to be practiced nowadays. Yeah.
Say grape juice or like specific kiddush wine people.
Yes.
Its own kiddush, and then you bring out the wine drinking. But is that an obvious enough?
Even they're not. Some people like kiddush wine. It's a sweet wine. Some people like the sweetness of the wine. So even then, it's not. The general assumption is not obvious enough. There can be exceptions. I'm to overspin it, but in general, I think the practice is to not make the bracha because of a lack of clarity as to what's better. And there could be rare situations. But in our case, we're ignoring that extra bracha of wine. We're just saying that the bracha of wine is not covered by a motzi. That's the another type of food that's not covered by motzi and wouldn't be included. Yeah. Sorry. No. Okay. Yes. Sorry.
How do after Berachot you're doing like benching on bread? Do you have to say on the film? Like obviously not, we don't. But
okay, so very, very good question. What about bracha achronos? How does it work with after bracha in these contexts? So anything eaten or drunk, including wine in the meal, is covered by beracha hamazon. If you have things before the meal, which is completely detached from the meal, then it could be all needed in bracha achrona, and I'll work through that systematically in a few moments. So I'm going to finish off the halachas around what bracha rishona you have to say in the meal, and then we'll speak about bracha achrona. But normally speaking, anything in the meal is included in the bracha achrona of azanos and kulabatova.
Okay, but when is it considered part of the meal? The grape juice before or the wine, whatever. So
I'll discuss that in more detail later. But basically, if it's clearly attached to the meal, then it would be covered by the beracha hamazon. So that means either it's eaten in the meal or something like kiddush, which is clearly a preparation for the meal. In other scenarios, not. But I'll work through that systematically. So I'm going to duck and avoid your question for a few moments. Yeah. Okay. So to summarize what we've said so far, the bracha rishona, the first bracha, the full bracha, is always covered by hamotzi, unless it's clearly not part of the nutrition experience, either because it's unexpected, like you went out and bought something else, or wine is its own drinking experience. It's not covered by the bracha rishona. Let's talk about another possible exception to the rule, which is the after bracha. Sorry, start again. Another possible exception to the rule, which is dessert or afters. So if you look in the classic poskim, they say that things which are clearly eaten, not for nutrition, and not to raise your appetite, but merely as a sort of kinuach, as a mouth-wiping exercise at the end of the meal, to sweeten your palate at the end of the meal, or maybe even mid-meal, those things wouldn't be covered by hamotzi, wouldn't be covered by berachos hamazon. Again, sorry, wouldn't be covered by hamotzi. Again, the logic is that hamotzi covers any food eaten for nutrition, eaten to sustain you. But if you have something which is clearly not to sustain you, and it's just eaten as a dessert, on that you do have to make the beracha. Now, eating habits have changed, and the question is, how far have they changed? If you look in the Mishnah Berurah says, if you have a raw vegetable, like a cucumber in the middle of the meal, no one eats cucumbers in the middle of the meal as part of your nutrition. You're clearly just having it to wipe your mouth, to remove oil from foods or the like. Therefore, you should say Beri Priadom on it in the middle of the meal. Now, no one paskins that anymore, right? Because we all like having raw vegetables in our meals, and we enjoy getting nutrition from raw vegetables, right? We consider that a normal way to live. And very, very interesting, none of our great-great-grandparents would have thought that. All of our great-great-grandparents would have said, in a meal, you have cooked food, right? You know, boiled cabbage and boiled potatoes and meat and so on. It was a different vision of what nutrition was. So we all eat cucumbers for nutrition, there'd be no question about it. Then the Mishnah Berurah says, but fruits, certainly no one has in the meal as a way of sustaining themselves. So on that, you would definitely make a bracha if you have fruit in the middle of the meal. Now, nowadays, we even sometimes have fruit salads in the middle of a meal as part of the meal. Right? Someone may serve salt beef with applesauce, or someone may bring in a Waldorf salad, a Caribbean salad, which has apples and orange bits and celery and pineapple in, and so on and so forth. And even though it's sweet and a fruit, nonetheless, we have that in the middle of the meal, and therefore we don't make a bracha on it. So eating habits, halachos of brachas, are sometimes dependent on how one eats and what's considered part of the meal. Now, if you look in the Mishnah Berurah, who's the sort of classic halachic source in this, he says that the end of the meal, if fruit or boiled fruit compote is served, you would make a bracha on it, because this isn't part of the meal. It's not a normal thing to have in the meal. It's not like a regular course in the meal. It's just a kinuach, a way of, again, just sort of clearing your mouth after eating, and therefore you would make ha'etz on that food. Now, you may be aware of this halacha, and you may yourselves, or you may know of people who, when they have fruit for afters, as a result, for dessert, for afters, they make a bracha on it, and they don't consider it covered by the hamotzi at the beginning. My personal view is that it is covered by the hamotzi at the beginning, and that nowadays it has become common enough that it is simply an additional course of the meal. So people plan their eating to leave a little bit of space for afters. In other words, they're seeing afters as a way of sustaining themselves. So they're having it as a course of the meal. Our eating habits have changed, and we enjoy filling ourselves with vegetables. Very weird, but that's what we enjoy doing. We sometimes like even having sweet salads in the middle of our meal and see that as a way of sustaining ourselves. Very, very weird, but that's what we do. And we also like having a little bit of ice cream or some fruit at the end of the meal, and we see that also as a healthy or pleasurable way of getting our nutrition. So all of this is considered part of the meal, and then for my personal view is that one doesn't say a bracha on afters in general. So just to summarize, there are poskim, there are rabbanim who paskin, that one does say a bracha on afters, because they consider an afters to be what's described as a kinuach, it's not part of the meal. And they would say you say a bracha on fruit and afters, you say a bracha on ice cream for afters, you say a bracha on chocolate for afters, and all these things. The only thing you don't say a bracha on for afters is mazonos. I don't want to go into all the technical details now, but the reason you don't say a bracha on mazonos when you have it for afters, according to these poskim, is mazonos is always a type of bread, a sofek bread, and therefore it's included in the bracha of hamotzi. But any other type of afters, you say a bracha on. And even with the mazonos, there could be situations where you say a bracha on it when it's definitely not a type of bread, if it's like noodles or pasta or whatever it may be. So there are poskim who basically say there's a whole section of halacha that you need to learn, which is the brachos to say on afters, when you do or you don't say a bracha on afters. My personal take on it is that in general we do not say a bracha on afters, because we see it nowadays as part of the meal. It doesn't mean you always have afters in your meal, but you don't raise eyebrows if someone brings in afters. It's not weird. It's not an addition. It's not an exception. It's not something unusual. It's just a fancy, perhaps a slightly fancier meal, but it's considered well within the norm. And therefore, it's just another course of the meal. We just live in a world where we like having afters as a course in the meal, and therefore it would be covered by hamotzi. There is an oral testimony that near the end of his life, the Chafetz Chaim was an amazing man. The Chafetz Chaim wrote the primary halachic work of the last couple of hundred years, the Mishnah Berurah, and he spanned really, if you like, the sort of end of what we'd call very olden days through to sort of the very early onset of modernity, because he lived a very long life, a little nearly 100, and he died in the late 1920s or the like, and he was born in the sort of 1830s or the like. So he spanned from 1830s, which feels very, very long ago, the old days. He died in the 1930s, which feels sort of just the edge of modernity. So he, in his Mishnah Berurah Sefer, which he published, I believe, in the late 1800s or the like, he writes this halacha without any hesitation that you make chayit on fruit or compote at the end of the meal. And as I said, he even says that you make a hardama if you have cucumber salad in the middle of the meal. We have an oral testimony from his family and from students and so on, that near the end of his life, he stopped saying a bracha on fruit stew for afters, because he became aware that the society had changed, and it began becoming more of a norm to have an afters at the end of the meal. So I'm just mentioning this, that one needs to be careful when one learns halacha, to make sure that, certainly with brachas, which is somewhat affected by eating habits, one needs to be careful that the halacha is appropriate. Okay, just to summarize what we've said, so we're not left completely confused. Bread covers anything in the meal that's eaten as part of the meal. Meal means a meal is a sustaining part of the meal. So it doesn't cover wine, because you have wine for its own reasons, and but it covers anything else which is being eaten to sustain you. Does it cover afters? Well, afters in the olden days maybe wasn't eaten as a course to sustain you. It was merely a token amount of food just to rinse your mouth out of the like, and therefore it wasn't covered by the beracha. But nowadays it seems to me that afters eating habits have changed, and we wouldn't make a bracha on afters. It's a course in the meal. The only exception to this might be where it's clearly not a course to the meal, but it's literally there to clear your mouth. Maybe someone gives out mints after the meal, mint. So mint just as a way of clearing the mouth or something like that. Maybe that's not part of the meal. That's the equivalent of the old-fashioned kinuach soda, and there you would say the bracha. So that's my personal psak that's I think makes sense, that that you don't make a bracha even on afters. But yes.
That includes like hot drinks, just compare it to
Yes, that's a very, very good question. Hot drinks. The Mishnah Berurah speaks about this also. A hot drink that's really brought after the meal, under what category exactly would it fall, and why don't you have to make a bracha on it? So a hot drink after the meal, it's not there to sustain. It's not drunk to help you eat, because you're drinking it after the meal, and it's not there as a what category exactly does it fall under? It's a little unresolved halachically, and therefore there are those who avoid this scenario because of the doubt. The Mishnah Berurah, as I said, speaks about this, and he leaves it as somewhat of a doubt and doesn't resolve it, because you're having it in order to let the food settle, but it's not there literally as to facilitate your eating. In practice, therefore, the practical halacha is that we do not make a bracha even on that drink. If you want to be from, you avoid the scenario, but you don't make a bracha on it, because it remains a question of doubt. What exactly is the status of these drinks? Again, they do it less now than they used to. At the end of a posh meal, people often come around with drinks, like a drinks, tray of hot drinks and so on. So it's gone a bit out of fashion, hasn't it?
Still, you see people do it.
You still see people do it. It's still going on, yeah. I remember, because I'm very, very, very old. I still remember when they used to come around with cigarettes and cigar trays at the end of the meals. Can you imagine that nowadays? It's a childhood memory. I just remember this from childhood memory. I remember them at the end of dinners going round and offering out cigars and cigarettes at the end of the meal, like in the same way as they come around now with trays of drinks. So, but anyway, we don't make brachos on smoking, so I don't know. Okay, so that's just a summary of the halachas. Sorry, yes, you had your hand up. You want to ask something about a mint or an after 8? Yeah, so maybe that would be an exception. That's something that's really just evidently just to clear the mouth. Okay. So that's part one of what I want to speak about. And let me address your question now because it deserves addressing, which is foods which are eaten before the meal and how brachas work when you have food before a meal. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. You have a meal laid and you want to eat something just before the meal, not for any halachic reason like kiddush or the like. You just feel that you'd like to eat something. So in truth, you should try not to do that. Try and wash. If you're going to have a washing meal, if it's going to be a bread meal, try and wash and then eat the food. And the reason for this is something that we discussed in previous weeks, that needlessly saying brachas isn't a good idea. Now, there could be a situation where saying the bracha is literally a bracha of atala, right? If I drink some water, said charcoal, drink the water, and then I want a bit more water later, and I think, you know what, I'd love to give praise to Hashem, I'm just going to say another charcoal. So that's a wasted bracha, that's a bracha of atala, that's certainly not allowed. Now here, you're not doing that, because you've got food, you've got an apple, or a piece of cake, or some piece of fish, and you want to have it now, so you need to make a bracha on it. So that's not that level of wasted bracha. Nonetheless, if you would just wait 3 minutes, you'd be ready to start the meal, you'd wash, you'd have your bread, and then you wouldn't need to say that charcoal on the fish or the chopped liver or whatever it is you're planning to eat. So in that sense, it's a wasted bracha that you're saying the bracha when you could have avoided saying the bracha by washing first. So the awe and the dignity that halacha lends to brachas is such that even that should be avoided. Brachas are precious, valuable things. They need to be counted with care, like precious diamonds and jewels, and therefore don't needlessly say a bracha even in the latter sort. So again, a bracha which is literally a wasted bracha of atala, a terrible thing, a misuse of the name of Hashem, a transgression of one of the 10 commandments, which says don't misuse the name of Hashem, terrible thing. That's where you just say a bracha for no reason whatsoever. In this case, there is a reason to say a bracha. You're having a piece of fish, but you could have avoided the bracha by waiting a few minutes and washing. So better, ideal, wait a few minutes and wash, and that way you won't have to have said that charcoal on the fish because the fish will be part of the meal. So this isn't a genuine wasted bracha. So if you particularly do want to eat now because you don't want to wait those 5 minutes and you're desperately hungry or you want to get your appetite going, some people have a trouble having their appetite going, and it helps them to have a little bit of food and then wait a bit and then start the meal and so on. So then you can make a bracha beforehand, before you eat, before you wash on the bread, and it's not a wasted bracha. But ideally, wash, have your bread, and everything will be included in the meal. Now, what happens if you have this food? So you made the bracha on the food. Now you need to say bracha achrona on it. So you have to say beracha nefashos or whatever it may be, alait, and then go and wash. Why should you say bracha achrona on it? And the answer is because this food that you had before you wash wasn't part of your bread meal, and therefore isn't by default covered by the berachos hamazon. So anything you have in a meal, including afters, including wine, is all included in Hazonos Edom Kula B'Tova, which is the general bracha for Hazon, for Hashem sustaining us. However, food that you have before the meal should really get its own bracha achrona. So just to summarize what we've said so far, you're, about to start a meal, and laid on the table is some chopped liver, and you decide you don't want to wait for the start of the meal, you want to have the chopped liver straight away. First halacha, wait. If you can wait a couple of minutes and wash and have that as part of the meal, better, that way you avoid saying extra brachas. Okay, for some reason you don't want to wait. A guest hasn't yet turned up and you're hungry, so you want to have the chopped liver now. Great, so you have the chopped liver now, you say charcoal on it. Then the guest arrives and you say, okay, everyone go and wash. No, don't go and wash. First say beracha nefashos on your chopped liver, because you have to say an after bracha on it. Then go and wash and have your bread meal. Why can't you include it in the berachos hamazon? Because it wasn't part of the meal. The berachos hamazon is on all the food you ate in the meal. It's not on food that you ate before the meal. Now, the only exception to this is where there's clearly a continuity between the food that I have before the meal and the food that I have in the meal. In other words, even though I had it before the start of the meal, nonetheless, it is somehow connected to the meal itself. So where there is a clear continuity between it and the meal, in that case, it would be covered by the berachos hamazon of the meal. What do we mean by clear continuity? A number of scenarios. Number one, if the purpose of eating it was continuity, such as I had it as an appetizer. So I'm let's say by nature, I don't really feel an appetite and I need to just have something to get my appetite going. The science behind this is you have a small quantity of food, then that gives your body a bit of a chance for the various hormones that control digestion to begin working, and it gets your appetite going. Then you have the main meal, so someone who needs to have an appetite. So there, even though you're having it before the meal, it's clearly part of the meal, its functionality is part of the meal, then you wouldn't say, oh, beracha achron on it, it would be included in the benching afterwards. So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two is where it's part of a meal clearly, because it's clearly there to sustain you. It's a piece of cake or something like that. So it's clearly a bulk food that's clearly part of the meal. So again, in that situation, it would be automatic, it would be covered by the benching afterwards. Scenario number three of it being a clear continuity is when there's a halachic reason for attaching it to the meal, like kiddush. And scenario number four of where there's clear continuity is where you continue eating that identical type of food in the meal. So you have chopped liver. As I said, you can't wait, so you begin eating it. Then the guests arrive and you go and wash, and you're going to carry on eating that chopped liver afterwards. So there's a clear continuity again. And then again, you wouldn't make a beracha achron on it. So just to summarize what we've said, food that you eat before the meal, the presumption is, needs its own beracha achron, it's detached from the meal. However, if it is attached to the meal, meaning there isn't a gap between having it and having the meal, it's not that you have it and then half an hour later you have the meal. There's no gap. You go straight from one to the other. And it's clearly serving as part of the meal. For example, because it's a bulk food like mazonos, or because it's kiddush, which is there to enable you to have the meal, or because it's a continuation of that type of food, because you have that food beforehand and you have that food in the meal itself, or because you're having it as an appetizer to get your appetite going. So in all those cases, it's clearly serving as part of the meal, and therefore that would be sufficient for it to be included, and you wouldn't need to say a separate beracha achron on it. Yes?
Does that also count for after the meal? Like, for example, I know when people bench on wine, you start to see like, oh, I get them, but why is that? Because it's like the only reason you're benching on the wine is because you are benching because you had the meal, and it's directly after the meal. It's like part of the meal. So why is that not included?
So that's an excellent question. The reason is because there you're benched already. So the berachos and the benching that you said, you've already said, so it can't cover the wine that you're having after the meal. It still doesn't help, because the whole concept of an after bracha is that I'm saying it after I've had the food. There's two types of bracha. There's a bracha before, which is a request for permission from Hashem for the food, and there's bracha afterwards on the result of eating, the satiation that follows. So an after bracha can't be said before you have the food. So that wine now needs an after bracha, and therefore you'd say an after bracha on the wine, even though in a sense it was in a type of way connected to the meal. So this is a logic that only applies before the meal. So this is a very interesting halacha, that you have to say the after bracha before you start your meal, and if you didn't say the after bracha, then you would have to say the after bracha during the meal. So if you have some fruit before the meal, which was detached from the meal, you weren't having it as an appetizer, you're not planning to have fruit in the meal, and the like, then you would have to say the after bracha in the meal. So this would be an unusual scenario. In the middle of your meal, you would now say Al ha'etz for your eight, etc., and that would be the after bracha that you say during the meal. Okay, so this is the foods which are before the meal and how they are included in the meal. By the way, even though kiddush is by definition associated or attached to the meal, if you do it straight away, I'm not talking about if you have kiddush and then you have some cake and then half an hour later you begin your meal, that's detached. If you do what we normally do when you're having a meal, kiddush and straight away wash, that would be attached to the meal. Havdalah is not like that, because Havdalah isn't connected to the meal. So if you do Havdalah and then you decide to start Lahavah Malka, again, you would have to say a beracha achrona on Havdalah, on the grape juice or the wine, and then have the wine, because the Havdalah in no way was connected to the meal. It's not an appetizer. It's not to facilitate the meal. It's not kiddush. That's somach b's'udah, and therefore it wouldn't apply to it. So just to summarize, in answer to your question, if you have food after a meal, you always have to bench on it because it's too late. The benching has already happened. If you have food before a meal, normally speaking, it's separate from the meal. You need to make your own beracha rishona, own beracha achron on it. It's not included in the meal. However, if it's clearly a continuation of the meal, that would be different. I'll give you another example of this. Imagine you're having a meal without bread. You decide to sit down and have, fish and chips. And then halfway through, you decide, I'm hungry, and I realized I'm also going to have some bread. So in that case, clearly, in that case, you would need to make a beracha acharona on the food that you've had so far, because that was separate from the bread meal, and then you would wash on the bread and you'd have the bread meal. So with cake, as I said, that's different because cake is considered a bulk food and therefore would be included in the benching, but everything else you'd have to say a separate beracha acharona on it before you wash, and that would then be and then you would start your bread meal. So that's a scenario where this halacha is again relevant, when you change your mind mid-meal and decide to have it as a bread meal. Okay, so to summarize, we've spoken about hamotzi covering everything in a meal. We said possible exceptions are drinks, but no drinks are also included as part of the meal. Wine is considered a separate drink, and therefore you do make a beracha on wine. Afters, it seems to be nowadays in general, afters is just considered another course in the meal. And then we spoke about foods that you have before the meal, either because you just decided to have something to eat before the meal, or because you decided to start eating and then you changed your mind in the middle and decided to wash. In all those cases, you need to make separate beracha shona and separate beracha acharona on those foods, and then go and wash. Any questions or thoughts about that? Yeah.
When you said is that like it has to be one more if you eat an apple and then you have another apple?
No, that would also be called continuation. Yeah. Okay. So we'll stop there for today. Next week I'll speak about other scenarios where you have an apple followed by another apple, and an apple followed by an orange, and things like that. How brachas work that cover different types of food. But for now, I think we'll stop here. And no one remembers if we had anything left over from last time, did we? Or you found your notes about that? Sorry. Hesach hadas. That was the only thing left over?
And then, yeah, you said that you talked about bread meals.
Good.
Starters,
And brachas acharona. Okay, so we've dealt with that. Fine. Okay. So maybe I should take a note of this. So I'm going to cover beracha acharona. Hesach. Fine. Okay, and then I would like to, move on from brachas. So I'm open for suggestions of other topics after this. Okay, that's noted. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much thank you for honouring me by coming to the share, and I wish you a good evening. Yes, sure.
There's an impact on Shabbat. Let's say you're going to someone for lunch and you want to bring a gift. Is it recommended to drop a gift before Shabbat if it's not something that's going to be eaten or used on Shabbat?
Okay, it's a very interesting question. What date is next? Today is the 4th, because next week is the 11th. So I'm just saving this. Okay, so let's save now. Let me turn off the recording also, since it's a separate topic. Okay.